Matthew 15, 29 through 31. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Lord, increase our faith. You wouldn't probably know it by looking at me right now, but in my younger years, I was extremely active and athletic and healthy. I mentioned I played basketball from second grade up to age 38. From high school on, I was a pretty serious runner, and after college, I also took up pretty serious biking. And believe it or not, I used to do all three in the same day. I'd get up early and go biking in the morning. I'd go run 4 or 5 miles in the afternoon, and then I'd play basketball in the evening. And not to toot my own horn, but I was quite healthy and quite a physical specimen. But weren't we all once upon a time back in the day? Over those 20 and 30 years I was playing basketball, I used to go and see my chiropractor probably 2 or 3 times a year, just as things would get a little out of whack. I had a great chiropractor, and I received tremendous benefit from him. I'm still a proponent of chiropractic services, and I have gone to a chiropractor a few times since we've been here in Rochester. But you have to have the right chiropractor. After 2 decades of seeing my chiropractor, I had an unfortunate job change. I lost my insurance, and I could no longer afford to see the chiropractor I'd seen for 20 years. I had a best friend who was a chiropractor, and he very graciously offered to see me for free. The first time I went to see him, he had a much more aggressive style of doing adjustments and manipulation. And the first time he laid hands on me, he herniated 2 or 3 of my discs. And that is when my back problems began. I couldn't move. I couldn't get up. I mean, if you've ever had something like that happen, the pain is just unbearable. It's level 10 pain. I don't know how I made it to my car. I don't know how I made home and got out of the car. But I had pretty close to 2 weeks of not doing anything but laying around on the couch until it got better. As I had imaging done and all that by the medical professionals to look at what had gone on, they discovered that I had a lot of the stuff that tends to go together when you start having back problems. I have pretty serious disc degeneration. It's degenerative. It gets worse over the years. I'm basically bone on bone between a couple of joints in my vertebrae. I have spinal stenosis, I have arthritis, and I have very mild scoliosis. My doctors tell me that if you were to look at medical imaging of everyone in the country, somewhere around 80 or 90% of our population would have similar things wrong. But the symptoms that they experience go from nothing to being debilitating. It all depends if those bulging discs and that arthritis is impinging a nerve or not. Well, it just so happens that my symptoms are on the debilitating end of things because I must be having a nerve that is being impinged. So that was in 2005 when I was 38 years old. After that initial injury, I continued to work, but as time went by, I was able to work less and less, and over the next 7 years, by the end of 7 years, I was pretty much down to working half-time. Part-time was all I could do. My wife and I decided, I had lived in my hometown for basically 40 years. I mentioned I felt called to do ministry there, and we were doing that. I had lived there my whole life, came back after school and spent 20 years ministering there. We decided to move to Rochester, particularly because I was pursuing my Doctor of Ministry. I enrolled at Northeastern Seminary on the campus of Roberts Wesleyan College, and we moved to Rochester so I could do that. 1 month after we moved to Rochester to pursue my DMin, and I re-injured my back bending over to pick something up in the shower. It's pretty funny how such simple things can hurt someone so severely, and I have not worked but sporadically since that time. I haven't been able to. Can't work full-time, can't work part-time. By God's grace, I'm back to doing some preaching and speaking as I am able to. So a month after we moved to Rochester, the reason we moved to Rochester no longer existed. I had to drop out of the D-Min program for the simple fact that I could no longer fulfill the classroom requirements. I couldn't sit in a chair long enough to attend the classes, which was required to get the degree. So I had to drop out of that program, and we were in real limbo. We just didn't know what to do. It felt like a wilderness, a limbo. We decided to stay in Rochester simply because that's all three of my daughters lived there and our grandson lived there. But in kind of a practical and vocational sense, couldn't really find a reason to be there. But here we are 7 years later, and we are still there. I find it very difficult to stand. As you can see, I could stand unsupported with nothing to lean on for about 2 minutes. So if you ever get me in a corner somewhere and want to talk to me, I'll probably interrupt you and say, do you mind if I sit down while we talk? If you come and look at me closely, you will see that I have not shaved in a couple of days. You might think that I am lazy and unspiritual, and that might be true. But the simple fact of the matter is, something that you don't think about and take for granted, I find it very difficult to stand long enough to shower and shave back to back. So I generally do it twice a week. I'll shower every day, but I generally get to shaving about twice a week. So that's where I'm at right here with the shadow. I can walk for about 5 minutes before I need to sit down or perhaps lay down. How long I can sit varies greatly on whether or not I have my fanny fluffer with me, which I've had all week, and it also depends on the kind of chair. If I can sit in a chair that kind of tips back where I can get my rear end out from under my head, I can sit a lot longer than if everything is lined up. Anytime my head is directly over my spine, something is getting compressed in there, which gets very painful very quickly, and then if I don't address it, it will seize up and my whole back will seize up again. So I do spend periods every day laying down to make sure that I don't overdo it and give my body a chance to recover. I'm averaging about once a year that I overdo it enough that my back seizes up again. And the last time that happened was, it'll be a year this fall. I had a good friend in ministry in Lockport, north of Buffalo, about an hour west of us, who asked if I would come out and preach there. Again, I find it very hard to say no to a chance to go and preach. It was an hour drive. I can drive about a half hour on my own, and that's about it. I don't know if you've heard the story. If you've seen, we just recently, this year, bought a Dodge Caravan cargo van. There's no seats in the back, and we threw a mattress back there, and if I have to drive much more than 40 minutes, my wife drives me while I lay on the mattress in the back. So that's how I got to Camp Odosagih this week. I laid in the back while my wife drove. She had to work this week and went back home, and she's coming back to get me, and I will lay in the back as well. So my wife has become my blessed chauffeur. Unfortunately, I have never been able to fall asleep in a vehicle. Just a little bit of motion keeps me awake. I don't know if over years of doing this, I'll get over that and I'll be able to fall asleep. But my wife is quite jealous. She can fall asleep anywhere at the drop of a hat. And she keeps driving and saying, if you could drive, Jeff, I'd be back there sleeping. So, but now it doesn't work. The reason why you're driving is because I can't, so I get to lay back here. But I have my pile of books back there, and I read while we drive. So I got asked to preach at Lockport, and I knew it would be difficult. And it was probably stupid for me to do it, but I drove the hour, stood to preach up. I can't stand when I preach if I have a hefty something or other to lean against. But for this, knowing I was going to be preaching 2 times a day for 6 days, I just thought it was easier to sit rather than to stand. So I drove there. I preached. He wanted to take me out to lunch afterwards. We went to a restaurant, and I spent another 40 minutes sitting in a restaurant and drove home, and my back seized up horrendously. And if you've never had that happen before, spasming, it was at least as bad, if not worse, than the original injury. I could not walk or even stand on my own for 11 days. For 11 days, I went from couch to wheelchair to bathroom to wheelchair to couch. I did that for 11 days. I couldn't walk on my own or drive or leave the house for 3 weeks. And that was pretty much my life for 3 weeks. And that really messed with my mind. I found myself pulling back from things that I may or may not have been able to do, because I don't want that ever to happen again. But again, I've seemed to have managed to do that to myself once a year over these last 7 years. And that was of great concern to me as I came here to preach. This has really been my test case of whether I could do something like this or not. And so far it has been wonderful and glorious. And I'm thanking God every night and praying every morning that He keeps me safe. And so far it has been wonderful. And again, I just need accommodations where I go. A nice chair, a fanny fluffer, my golf cart, all that sort of stuff. And it has been great. And I'm so thankful to be here. I have been denied traditional back surgery by at least 6 different doctors. I kept hoping, well, maybe I'll find someone who will cut me up and make me better. If you know anything about back surgery, it's generally a coin toss. It can make you better or it can make you worse. And every single doctor said the same thing. They looked at my situation and they said I'm in the highest risk category for it to get worse rather than better, and they wouldn't touch me. I had one doctor say, sure, I'll do the surgery, but it'll probably make you worse. So I'm like, no thanks. When you think about that, what does that say? They just basically want my money, knowing that it's going to make me worse? So I said, no thank you to that. However, something has just come up recently. There's a new emerging and experimental procedure involving stem cell therapy for joint injuries, and particularly back injuries. This is the very thing that Tiger Woods had done that allowed him to come back and win the Masters, if you saw that this last year in the news. What they do is they take stem cells from your hip bone and inject them into your discs, and it promotes healing and growth in the discs. The current stats are 80% of the people that undergo this procedure achieve 60% improvement or better. Now, because I have 4 or 5 different things wrong with me, if my main pain issues and mobility issues are coming from the discs, this procedure will help, hopefully. But if it's coming from the arthritis or the stenosis, it probably won't help. However, this medical clinic called Blue Tail Medical Clinic in St. Louis, Missouri, viewed my imaging and they approved me for this procedure. So in 2.5 weeks, September 18th, I'm flying first class to St. Louis, Missouri to undergo this procedure. And it's the first real hope I've had of things getting better in 14 years. And I find myself barely daring to hope. It's funny when you live with a disability or chronic pain for 15 years. I don't know, it's just hard to hope. And I fight to not take my identity from my disability. And it's real easy to fall into that. I said the first message here, my identity is in Christ, and I don't want to take, but you almost come to depend on this. Your life becomes so normal living this way, and I think, oh, gee, if I get better, well, then people will expect me to do this again, and I'll have to take on this responsibility, and it's easy to give into fear, but I find myself hoping against hope that this might improve my situation. I would greatly appreciate your prayers if you think about it. After the procedure, they say you can start feeling a relief of pain in 6 to 8 weeks, but complete healing from the procedure takes 9 to 12 months, which I thought was interesting. So it isn't entirely possible that even if it works, I could come back here next year, if Ron will have me, and not be that much better yet, but we'll see. But I would greatly appreciate your prayers. So, I mean, this really changed my life. I was an avid basketball player. I have not touched a basketball since I hurt myself first 14 years ago at age 38. I love to hike. Don't hike anymore. I love to bike. Can't do that. I can't travel. I've missed out on a lot of family events and family traveling and family vacations. And it has just been my way of living for the last 14 years. I've had people pray over me for healing tons of times, and I will continue to do that. I continue to pray, and people continue to pray for me, and I'll continue to do that until if the Lord heals me or not. If this ends up being my thorn in the flesh, Well, I will continue to pray with faith and authority for other people's needs in the midst of that. The main and early thing that God worked in me during this season was a very simple question that I heard him ask me. Jeff, if I never heal you, will you still worship me? If I never heal you, will you still love me, trust me? Will you still serve me? That was a pretty easy question for me to answer. Tomorrow with the ugly, I'll talk about quite a bit more difficult question I heard subsequently from God also. But that was a pretty easy question to answer. Well, yeah, sure I will. No problem. That's not a hard question for me to answer, God. You're good, you're true, you're faithful. You don't owe me anything. You gave everything for me. There's no promise of having perfect health in this life. And he just showed me how, Christ himself became a man and probably suffered more than anyone that ever lived. And yet we think our lives should be convenient and comfortable and free of suffering, when Christ promised in more than one occasion the exact opposite. In the Gospel of John, he says, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world." That's the question and the answer all in one little sentence. You will have trouble in this world. We live in a fallen world, and we're subject to disease and whatnot. You will receive trouble at the hands of other people, at being persecuted and maligned, but it doesn't matter. Take heart, for I have overcome the world. And God has recently made very precious to me the verse from 2 Corinthians, which I quoted already. I'm going to try and quote again. "Therefore we do not lose heart, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Therefore we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, because what is seen is temporary, and what is unseen is eternal." If I live to be 90 and I suffer intently every day of my life, it is still light and momentary compared to the glory that waits for us, that we can barely wrap our hands around or wrap our heads around. It will be glorious, and it makes every day of suffering in this life worth it. And I know that Christ is accomplishing something in me and in us through that suffering that we experience. And there's so many examples of people throughout history. Fanny Crosby being blind her whole life. Johnny Erickson Tada being paralyzed from the neck down since the age of 16 and having an incredibly influential worldwide ministry. I don't know if you've heard or maybe seen online or on TV a gentleman by the name of Nick Vujicic. I believe he's Australian, I can't remember, but he was born with no no arms and no legs. He's a body with a head on it. And he talks of his struggles growing up. And now he has an international traveling evangelistic ministry where he tells his story. I think I told you already that I worked for 5 years with a brain-injured gentleman that needed round-the-clock care. And his family and his stories is both tragic and incredible. He was the youngest of 5 siblings, and 2 years before him, he had a sister die in a car accident. His dad was a pharmacist, and his sister was in the company van making pharmaceutical deliveries and was hit and died in a car accident. So they went through that once. 2 years later, this gentleman, as a senior in high school, driving home from baseball practice from high school, a Con Edison truck crosses over the center line and hits them head on. He's the only one in the car. The car is full of 5 teenagers. He's the only one that's hurt seriously. Everyone else walks away. And he suffers a serious and traumatic brain injury. They didn't think he would live. He did. They never thought he would speak again. He finally learned to speak again. He never thought he'd be able to feed himself. He did. It took years, and in some cases decades, to reach those benchmarks. But he is still in a motorized wheelchair and will be for the rest of his life. He is just the neatest, funnest guy to be around. He loves to talk. He loves to laugh. He's kind and he's generous. He's very different. The way his personality was affected by this brain injury, He's quite goofy. He loves to laugh. He sometimes laughs at inappropriate times, but he's just a wonderful man to be around. And on top of his brain injury, he also has what's called hemispheric paralysis. Rather than being paralyzed top to bottom, he's paralyzed left to right. So the left side of his body is paralyzed, so he can't use his left arm or his left leg. His right leg was broken so badly in the accident, they had to fuse his knee together. So he can wiggle his right leg at the hip, but he can't move his knee. And then he has full use of his right hand. So he drives his wheelchair with his right hand, and he spends his whole life in a wheelchair. This family has gone through this 2 times within the span of 2 years. His family, his parents, are the most sincerely devoted Catholics I've ever met in my life. Now, we would probably all disagree with some points of theology with them, but I am quite sure that they are born again, that they have a genuine relationship with Jesus Christ. And when you go through stuff like that, you have 2 choices. Is it going to make you bitter, or is it going to make you better? And they are the most incredibly shining testimony of attesting to God's goodness and faithfulness in the midst of tragedy that I have ever been around. And their lives are really a testimony. And my friend Mike, the gentleman in the wheelchair, he touches people's lives every day. He's just such a nice and fun person and joyful person to be around. He really touches people's lives. And it's just amazing how God transforms tragedy and makes good come out of it and conforms us in the image of Christ by going through hard things. And as we have a chance to be around other people, we can influence their lives as well. I mentioned earlier that the greatest personal frustration in my spiritual life is having a disconnection between my faith and my experience. Believing so wholeheartedly, radically, probably more than most people, in the reality of healing and miracles for today, and just seeing it so infrequently, both for others and for myself. And I'm still wrestling with that with God. The passage that I read this morning, Jesus healing people by the bucket loads that come in, and the crippled and the mute and the lame and the blind. It just gives me joy and it gives me hope reading that and seeing that and hearing that. And yet I am still in that in-between place, the already but the not yet of the kingdom, having a taste of the kingdom, but waiting to see the consummation of it. The great 20th century pastor and author, and I believe modern-day prophet, A.W. Tozer. You've probably all heard of him, if not read something of his. He said a lot of good stuff. If you're a post on Facebook kind of guy, you can find A.W. Tozer quotes all day to put on Facebook. This is a very provocative quote for me, but I do like it. A.W. Tozer said, "It is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply." Part of me reacts against that, thinking about my Heavenly Father hurting me deeply. And yet, whether it's just the natural consequence of living in a fallen world, or whether it is that God orchestrates things that are difficult and trials for us, the fact remains that we get hurt deeply in this life, and God uses those things to transform us into His image and to attain to greater blessings that we probably would have had if life was easy and comfortable and convenient. When you read end-time stuff and Revelations and whatnot, it talks a lot about the saints ruling and reigning with God for all of eternity. And it talks about us judging nations and whatnot and being more superior than the angels. I believe that we're being trained for that now. This battle now is to train us to rule and reign with Christ for all of eternity. And for whatever reason, His blessing is often tied to trials and temptations. I want to read another passage from Matthew 13. And just recently in this season of life, I've been thinking quite intently about this last point that I want to discuss with you. Matthew 13, verses 54 to 58. And it's interesting, the thing I read earlier is in Matthew 15. So these two stories are 2 chapters apart from each other. The one story in Matthew 15 that I just read It sounds like Jesus literally heals everybody that shows up. Everyone that comes to him, they get healed. Two chapters earlier in 13, this is what happens. Coming to his hometown, he began teaching the people in their synagogue, and they were amazed. Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary, and aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? Where did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town and his own home. And he did not do many miracles there because of their faith. 2 chapters later, he's dispensing miracles like candy from a machine. I don't want that to sound flippant, but he healed everyone that showed up. And yet something even about the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, God in the flesh, was affected by people's lack of faith so that he could not do many miracles there. And it got me thinking specifically about our area of Western New York. I'm sure you're aware that the great evangelist Charles Finney traveled much of the country in this area between 1825 and 1835 doing revival meetings. He called the area of Western New York the burnt over district. And if you look at a map, it's basically you draw a line from Rochester down to the border of Pennsylvania and everything to the west of that, he called the burnt over district. And what he meant by that was that this area during that time had been burnt over by other false religious teachings that were growing in this area, such that when he came through, true faith could not take root. These people had been burnt by false religion, basically. Mormonism, founded in Western New York. The Millerites, which was basically a Christian, quasi-Christian group, but they had some goofy ideas about the second coming of Christ. That was in Western New York. The Fox Sisters, anyone heard of the Fox Sisters? They were in the Chautauqua area. They revived modern spiritualism, having seances, contacting the dead, talking to dead relatives, the Fox Sisters, Western New York. The Oneida community, a communistic community that believed in group marriage, Western New York. And the social gospel, the belief that you get saved by doing good stuff and relieving human suffering. That's what saves you, not the blood of Christ. All those things birthed and grew in Western New York, and this was the environment and the atmosphere that Charles Finney experienced when he came through Western New York and had his least effective ministry right here. We're in the very area. Odosagih is in the same, it's in that lined in, shaded in area of Western New York. We are in a perniciously secular state, particularly, and increasingly secular country, but perniciously so in the Northeast and New York. And I can't help but find myself wondering, are there not many great miracles being done here because of our collective lack of faith? If that is the case, I don't think that that is an unwinnable war. We need to be discerning and aware of that, and there might be some spiritual warfare to be done, and we do need a breakthrough, and we do need a deliverance from that kind of thing, and we just need to be aware of that. A few months ago, I saw the result of a study done by, I believe, the Pew Research Group. The Pew Research Group does a ton of studies on religious issues, and they did a national study on the 50 most secular, least religious cities in America. Do you know that in the top 8 are all the cities in upstate New York? Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Albany. Those 4 are all in the top 8 most secular, least religious cities in the country. We live in a perniciously secular area. And I believe wholeheartedly it is not just a natural phenomenon. There are thrones and dominions and powers and principalities behind that stuff, and we need to be aware of such and fight against it and continue to pray with authority and faith for people's healing and wait for that breakthrough to come. I've had quite a few people in my life and sphere of influence back home, church folks and friends and families, look at me and pretty much compliment me by what grace and strength I've put up with this physical affliction that I have. I'm very thankful for that. You don't know a lot that goes behind the scenes. I'll talk about that tomorrow. But really, that is my goal and my desire, to still be a testimony of God's goodness and faithfulness in the midst of affliction, to still be a shining example of joy and hope in the midst of affliction. And by His grace, I hope to do that. And isn't that really the call and the testimony for all of us? Every single person, you're going to face trials, emotional, financial, physical, familial, relational. There's going to be serious trials. All of us in here probably have aches and pains and joints and this and that and migraines and arthritis and everything. It's part of being part of a fallen creation. It just is. And God will teach us and train us and make us more like Himself as we go through these trials. And He gives us every opportunity to say to those around us, God is good and faithful and true, and we have a choice to make. Will it make me bitter, or will it make me better? And now I'm not saying that we just have to put up with that stuff too. Like I've told you a couple of times, I will pray for anybody for any ailment at any time, and I will do so with faith and authority, and I will expect God to show up and to heal you. And I'm not going to ask God to heal you. I'm going to say, in the name of Jesus Christ and by the authority of His blood, I speak healing into this body. And one of these times it's going to take. It's not diminished my faith to keep trying. One of these times it's going to take. And I'll pray for you after service today or before service tomorrow, anything you're going through, whatever ails you, I'll pray for you. And one of these days we're going to break through the pernicious stuff going on in Western New York, and something's going to happen. And revival will break out again. So again, I'm not saying we just have to put up with it, but for the stuff that we do put up with, let's do so with God's grace, with joy, and with hope, fully convinced with complete assurance of the eternal glory that's waiting for us that far outweighs them all. And I don't know if there's many more things that can be a shining testimony for those that don't know Him than how we handle and respond to suffering. Let's encourage one another. Let's comfort one another. Let's bear one another's burdens in the way. And let's press into Christ and find His joy and hope as we do so.